Today I'm veering a little bit away from my usual content. I was on my laptop the other night looking for something to watch, and I came across a documentary that was showing on RTE iPlayer that sent me back to my primary school days and before corporal punishment was abolished in 1982. While you might think this new law came into effect straight away, it didn't. It continued to exist until 1997, because up until then teachers could not be prosecuted. In 2015, when the common law defence of reasonable chastisement remained available to parents, they too now faced a charge of assault. In response to a complaint filed with the European Committee of Social Rights, the defence was abolished under the Children First Act 2015. The age demographics of my channel is mainly 45 years old and above, and so I'm sure there are many of you out there that suffered corporal punishment in primary school, which was from the age of 4 to 12 years, and secondary, which was from the age of 12 to 18 years. I have many a story myself, and will most likely include some of these in this video, and I would love to hear your stories in the comments also. That's after you subscribe and like, of course. So let's begin. These are their stories, your stories, and my stories. There have been many investigations into child sex abuse and physical abuse within the church and state institutes in Ireland, from the Ryan Report to the Murphy Report to the Scoping Inquiry, among many others. But what wasn't acknowledged or investigated was the everyday abuse that children suffered, which was dished out by our lay teachers, nuns, brothers and priests. Now this abuse came in all forms and levels, and this is what we will be exploring, because for me we are the forgotten children. While the general consensus was, Asher, didn't it make us stronger? It could have been worse, or it didn't do us any harm. Was it not only legal to get a slap or a beating at home, but it was also legal in schools, and it was accepted by society. If you came home and told that you got 6 of the best on each hand, and always the tips of the fingers, not the palm, the attitude was you must have done something to deserve it, or you'd get another slap for getting in trouble in the first place. So you learn not to tell, because you got no sympathy or you'd be punished again. I also noticed that some got it worse than others, and what I mean by that is the boys got it worse. The girls got the basic punishment that was allowed, but the boys, well, that was on a whole other level. The choice of weapon to inflict punishment on children was anything from a leather strap to a cane, a ruler, a leg of a chair, the blackboard duster, a tree branch, and of course actually putting their hands on the children. Many didn't use the latter as they didn't want to hurt themselves. The main consensus was if you didn't obey, you got beaten into obedience, and then there were some sadistic teachers who gave out beatings just for the hell of it. It was a case of predator and prey. Us as children couldn't even protect each other or go to our parents for help. All we could do is sit in the classroom and watch and hope we weren't next. Theo Dorgan, poet and broadcaster, and his friend, film festival director Mick Hannigan, who was featured in this documentary, went to the North Monastery School in Cork, also known locally as the Mon, in the 1960s. Theo would say he was loved and cared for by his family and never knew violence until he went to this school. He had heard rumours that it was a tough school, not because of the fellow students or because it was a rough area, but because of the treatment of the students by the teachers. In each classroom, the leather strap was proudly displayed, either on the teacher's desk or it was carried on their person at all times, ready to be used. Some of these teachers carefully inserted half crowns in the confines of the leather strap to give it a bit of weight and strength. There was a graduation of slaps for each teacher put together by the students of the school, from soft slaps to outright abuse. It went from looking at a teacher, that is, making eye contact, to doing something you shouldn't be doing, to not knowing your lessons, to not doing anything at all. It wasn't just a daily occurrence, but an hourly occurrence. You learned to find something cold to put your hands on, like cold running water or cold metal to ease the sting. Next to the slaps you got was the anticipation of what humour the teacher was going to be in each day and what level of violence was going to be inflicted on the children. You were constantly in survival mode, not only for yourself but for the children around you. Mick, Theo's friend, told a story of Theo taking crystals from the chemistry class and dropping them into a large puddle of water outside the school and it turned the water red. He said it was a beautiful sight to see. A teacher spotted this and lost complete control and laid into Theo with his fists. Theo was only 14 at the time. He would say that he does not remember this incident, as there were so many, only that his mother did go to the principal about the incident, but the violence was so normalised by then, nothing was done. Another man featured in the documentary was a man named Peter Kane. Watching him as a 72-year-old man now would break your heart. He came across as the sweetest man. He was so considerate, not even wanting to interfere with filming by having a sip of coffee. Peter went to school in the 60s also. He attended the De La Salle School in Navan Town, about an hour's drive from Dublin. One particular teacher would come in on a Monday morning to class and discuss the weekend football with certain students, which would take up the first half hour of the class. Then the sleeves would be rolled up, the watch would come off, and all hell would break loose. Peter would say that every day he went into school there was an element of fear, and the violence would start for the simplest of reasons. To avoid a beating, catechism was one subject Peter studied, like his life depended on it. He would stay up until 11 o'clock at night, each night, to learn it off by heart so he wouldn't get a beating the next day for not knowing it. But Peter was not always successful in knowing his catechism, and he would be brought up to the top of the classroom with a few clatters first, and then once at the top of the classroom, he would get 6 of the best on each hand. Peter would refuse to cry, and therefore the beatings would continue, bouncing his head off the blackboard, running him the length of the room by the scruff, and slamming him against the wall. With this, Peter collapsed to the ground, hurting his back. The teacher picked him up and started beating on him again. It took him weeks to recover after this incident. Peter the child didn't understand, but Peter the adult did. He saw this teacher as a sadistic monster. I wish I had his name so I could name and shame him, but unfortunately I don't. But I do have one name of another sadistic monster within this school, and that was Master Liam Craven. Peter would explain that the classroom was divided into 2. Some had made their confirmation and others hadn't. Those that had been confirmed went to this teacher. He loved beating on the children, especially one friend of Peter's, Jerry. This Craven monster was over the GAA in Meath at the time. If you were good at sports, well then you escaped his wrath. But if you weren't, then you suffered under him. I know even now it is the same. If you were good at hurling or Gaelic football, you were seen as a mini celebrity and treated as such. But if you weren't, then you paid it for within the school system. Jerry was not good at sports, and as he put it himself, he was fucked from the start. He came from a poorer background, as many of us did. If you weren't from a farming background or a child of a teacher, nurse, doctor or profession, you were nothing. Craven had a press full of weapons he used. One he called the sugar stick, which was a leg of a chair where some of the smoothness of the wood had worn, and the grain was sticking out. So when he used it on the children, it would cut the skin. Jerry would also say it was the anticipation of what was about to happen was worse than the actual pain of being beaten. At 10 years of age, Jerry was late for school one morning. When he arrived into school at around 11 a.m, Craven grabbed him by the hand and began hitting him. And as a natural reaction, Jerry's hand would fall away. So in turn, he would be held by the wrist and the caning would continue. I personally remember this myself happening to me. It wouldn't until Craven saw blood coming from Jerry's hand would he stop. He remembers escaping from the school after the incident and running home. He didn't go to school for a few days after, and so a Garda was sent to his house by the school to summon him back. The Garda arrived on his push bike and spoke with Jerry's mother. Obviously, this conversation did not go well, as his mother grabbed the kettle of boiling water from the stove and chased the Garda away from the door. Jerry said all he could see was the Garda on his bike, hightailing it up the road with his mother running after him with the kettle of boiling water. The Garda obviously didn't get the memo that you never cross an Irish mammy. Jerry did eventually go back to school and did his first year in secondary school, but left after that, with no real education and no qualifications. Unfortunately, the drink would get hold of him at a very young age. By the time he reached 18, he took the boat to England and lived on the streets for 8 years. drinking and not looking after himself. One day at Victoria Station, a man bought him a ticket to get home to Ireland, and so he did. He continued his drinking for 2 years, until he would end up in hospital. He had a complete breakdown, and when he got sober, he had to face his demons. And one was how he had been treated as a young boy in school, how he had been abused and the effect the beatings had on him. Jerry would remain sober for the next 30 years. He would say that he was a product of his environment. The two main things in his life was fear and then anger. Not everyone agreed with what was going on in Irish schools. One person was Senator Owen Sheedy Skeffington. He put his concerns to the Dáil, which is our Irish government, in 1954. 10 years later, the Minister for Education decided free education would be extended to all children in the state. But this would only increase class sizes and put extra burden on the teachers, and this led to corporal punishment being implemented even more on an already strained education system. In the 1960s, more people of importance started to stand up to the church and state about corporal punishment, and they would pay a high price. One such person was Dr. Patrick Randall. He was a doctor living and working in Navan. One day he had a mother come in with her 9-year-old son, Norman Murray. She was looking for a note from the doctor to ask the teachers to stop hitting him on his broken hand and hit him on his good hand. The doctor turned around and said to her they shouldn't be hitting him at all. The doctor proceeded to go up to the school to speak to the principal and ask him did he know that one of his teachers was using a rubber hose to beat the children. The principal leaned back on his chair, reached down and leaned forward with a whack on the table with a leather strap and said, quote, "Well, this is what I use." Dr. Randall replied, "Well, you won't be using it much longer." How wrong he would be. Dr. Randall and his wife Mary, among others around the country, lobbied to bring attention to what was going on in Irish schools and how the children were being beaten. Dr. Randall began by writing letters to the national and local papers, but the problem was they wouldn't publish them. In 1969, the Sunday World, an English newspaper, decided to come to Ireland to investigate what was going on here. As you can imagine, this went down like a lead balloon with the Irish people. Some of the children that were interviewed were featured using their photographs. There were ructions all over the country, but it wasn't because of what was happening to the children in school, but because it was an English newspaper reporting on Irish matters. It was to be a 2-part series, and once the first part was released, the second part never got to Navan the following week. Dr. Randall, speaking to an English newspaper, and not a native of Navan, speaking about schools in Navan, was a big no-no. He would pay the price. He lost about half his practice. Not long after, word had reached America and a crew from NBC arrived on Irish shores in 1969. Children were interviewed and it was heart-wrenching to listen to, and the American people were horrified when it was aired over there. One of the children that spoke was 9-year-old Norman Murray and his mother. Their neighbours turned against them and they were chastised for giving the interview. Norman left school at 10 years of age, again with a basic education and mentally scarred from what he had gone through in school. The campaigners against corporal punishment were named as troublemakers. They were going against the grain. They did interviews on radio and television, trying to make the Irish people aware of what was happening to the children was not acceptable anymore. A workshop for the blind was a semi-state owned business, and they made canes and leather straps specifically for the schools. It was cheaper to buy straps and canes than it was to hire more teachers. One day there was an auction selling off a basket of canes and straps, so the people who were lobbying for new legislation to abolish corporal punishment bought them all and burnt them outside the Department of Education during a protest. This was just the beginning of what was to come. As more campaigners came together, more parents started to reach out to tell their stories. One such story was a little boy, 8-year-old David Moore from Drimna in Dublin, whose parents were distraught after he came home one day after a beating and he couldn't sit down. His mother went up to the school and she got no satisfaction whatsoever. The campaigners said enough was enough and so decided to bring a case against the Christian brother involved, with no cost to the family. They couldn't get one Catholic practicing solicitor to touch the case. it would have been career suicide for them. The jury decided that the little boy had been excessively beaten by brother Joseph Quinn. They awarded David damages of 1 shilling, which is 1/20th of a pound in old money, or 12 pence, which in today's money is 5 pence in euros. The Christian brother was back teaching the next day and continued his reign of terror. In the mid to late 70s, the campaigners could not only get the state and church on side to end corporal punishment, but even the teachers' union would not come on board, as they did not want to take away a teacher's capacity to enforce discipline. Another 10 years again would pass before finally the state started to listen and corporal punishment would be abolished. It was all about beating and education out of the children, and another school that was featured in the documentary was St. Kieran's College in Kilkenny, my home city. This is where my brother went to school as a boarder. He would be let home once every 2 weeks, and he would have stories. He got the cane on a regular basis and would have been considered a good student, even saying he'd make a great priest. One story he told me was that he was in class one morning and he forgot to wind his watch. Most of you would be familiar with this. He was spotted winding his watch in class and he was sent down to the principal's office and received 6 of the best on the hand he was using to wind his watch. How petty was that? My other brother started school there a few years later, and he would last just a week. He got absolutely hammered in there and refused to go back. Owen Costello and Mick Quinn were 2 other students that went to school there around the same time as my brother. Father Seamus McAvoy was the headmaster at the time. He was to be feared, and that is only scratching the surface of who this man really was. Father McAvoy had a 2-tier system. The queue outside his office, which is where you went to be punished. When the light over his door went green, you went into the office, handed over the slip of paper that you got from the teacher, telling Father McAvoy what you had done. You got the beating he saw appropriate and you went about your day. But then there was the 2nd tier, where Father McAvoy stalked the corridors, and believe me, there were a lot of corridors to stalk. This place is huge. He'd look through the windows of the classroom, and when he spotted a target, he'd swing open the door and straight to his victim and start beating on him. The whole class would be disrupted. The teachers and students could do nothing but stand by and watch. Like I said, even if you told your parents, they would say, I'm sure it wasn't that bad, or you probably did something to deserve it. Poor Owen would say he wasn't a great student, but it was because he was dyslexic and he also struggled with numbers. But the thing about Kieran's College is it prides itself on producing great hurlers. So if you were good on the pitch, there was a little leeway when it came to the classroom. But Father McAvoy showed no mercy. Owen remembers being 2 months into his first year, and one day they were all between classes waiting for the next teacher to come in. As boys will be boys, they were blackguarding by throwing around a bobble hat. Unfortunately, Father McAvoy was passing by the door and a hush came over the classroom, and Owen didn't know why. Of course, he was the one holding the hat as this happened. Father McAvoy swung open the door and made a beeline for Owen. Owen bracing himself in the chair, he received 1 punch, then 2 to each side of his face. Father McAvoy then turned on his heels and marched out the door again. Owen went home that evening and said nothing, but he was in pain and in pain for the next 2 weeks, until his mother got suspicious of him being so quiet and not eating properly. Eventually Owen would tell her that he had been punched in the face by Father McAvoy. Well, she went mental and brought Owen to the family doctor. He was referred to a hospital and x-rays were taken. While there was no broken bones, he did have joint damage. But Owen would not only be left with the memory of what happened, but to this day, now in his 50s, he still gets a dull pain in his jaw, and his jaw clicks in cold weather. Now to one of my own stories. My primary school was a prefab with 2 classrooms, toilets and a small staff room. In one room you had infant class to first, and then in the master's room the classes were from 2nd class to 6th. The fear was instilled into you from the minute you started school at the age of 4. Mrs. Grace was a witch. She looked like one and acted like one. I remember her using a ruler, but this was no ordinary ruler. It had steel in the middle but wooden on the outside. If we didn't know our spellings, she would make us stand at the back of the room for what seemed like hours. I was anemic at the time and had nearly died from pneumonia and was only back to school, and I'd always faint if left standing too long, but this would not deter her. It came to a point where my mother complained, as I always had to be brought home. Once she complained, my punishment changed, and that's when the ruler came out. Other forms of corporal punishment were to be caught by the ear and have it twisted, or caught up by the two ears and slammed to the ground. My own experience was tame in comparison to what the boys got. I was only given 6 of the best, and it varied from getting it on one hand to 2, and always the tips of the fingers. I remember the sting to this day, and you always knew who had been punished, as we would all have our arms crossed with our hands under our oxters, which is a Gaelic expression referring to armpits. 3 boys in my classroom got it the worst. Every day they went to school and got punished, and I'd be nearly in tears as it happened. One chap had gone into the master's desk drawer and found shiny cut-out stars, the kind you get on your work pages if you did good. The master, Mr. Cummins, a huge man and a walking alcoholic who turned up to school drunk on some days. He found out, brought him to the top of the classroom, bet him around the place and ran him, caught by the ear, the whole length of the room, and rammed him so hard, head first, the boy went through the wall and collapsed. The hole in the wall remained there up to the day I left, and I'm sure long after. As early as 1932, the Department of Education stated that only the principal teacher or another person authorised for the purpose should inflict corporal punishment. Only a light cane or rod may be used for the purpose of inflicting the corporal punishment. The boxing of children's ears, the pulling of hair, or similar ill treatment is absolutely forbidden and will be visited with severe penalties. No teacher should carry about a cane or other instrument of punishment. These penalties were seldom, if ever, applied. By now, the European courts, and with public outcry over what was happening, the state were forced to act. In 1981, the Minister for Education, John Boland, would ban corporal punishment from 1982 onwards in both primary schools and secondary schools, but it would be another 15 years in 1997 before teachers and other educators could be prosecuted for laying their hands on children. This in itself prolonged the suffering of children behind closed doors in some schools. By 1962, over 500,000 pupils were attending primary and secondary schools in Ireland. By the time the ban on corporal punishment came into effect in 1982, over 750,000 students were in full-time education. The Department of Education alleged that during this time, only 108 complaints were made regarding physical abuse within the schools between 1962 and 1982. This to me seems very few in comparison to the numbers attending. Many complaints were nipped in the bud at school level and never reached the Department of Education, or families got a visit from the local priest to silence them, or it got worse for the child in school who had complained, and so their allegations were withdrawn. One man did succeed in suing the school he went to. The first offer was €25,000, with no admission of liability to what happened to him in school. This was refused. Eventually, he would get the offer he wanted of €100,000, but again with no apology or admission of abuse. To the school, the money was admission enough. They were basically telling him to take his money and go. The most recent scoping inquiry into sexual abuse within industrial and ordinary schools was released, with no mention of the physical abuse endured by the children of Ireland. This inquiry is now being redressed, and the hope is that they will include physical abuse and the children will be compensated or even be heard. Not all the lay teachers, priests, nuns and Christian brothers were abusers in the physical sense, but what they did do was stand idly by with their hands in their pockets and their mouths shut. So were they actually just as bad? Owen did reach out to Father McAvoy years later, asking him to meet up. So in July 2023, Owen went to the nursing home Father McAvoy was living in. Owen sat himself in front of McAvoy and said to him, "You hurt me, and you hurt a lot of boys in your care. And that hurt has lasted me personally a lifetime." Owen got to say what he wanted to say to this monster. He then stood up, reached out his hand to Father McAvoy, and he also reached out the hand that abused so many boys in St. Kieran's College, and they shook hands. This to Owen was the end, and he forgave Father McAvoy. It was over for him. The De La Salle School in Navan unreservedly apologised for failing in the care of their students. The Congregation of Christian Brothers in Ireland said it is deeply ashamed that abuses occurred.